This is not a dog. You need to call the police right now." Dr. Ryan Collins didn't raise his voice, but the room seemed to freeze the moment he said it. And for a second, Ethan Walker thought he had misheard him, because just 10 minutes earlier, his 8-year-old daughter Lily had been sitting on the cold clinic floor in her sneakers and denim jacket, gently holding onto Shadow's collar, whispering to him like he was the best thing that had ever happened to her. And now suddenly the veterinarian was staring at the same animal like it was something he couldn't explain, something he didn't even want to touch again. And Ethan felt a strange pressure build in his chest, the kind that doesn't come from fear exactly, but from the realization that something is about to change in a way you can't control. And it all started 3 days earlier, on a quiet Saturday afternoon just outside of Cedar Ridge, when Ethan had pulled his pickup into a small roadside adoption event that Megan had spotted online, a place with folding tables, a few volunteers, and a handful of dogs waiting behind temporary fences. Nothing unusual, nothing that would make you stop and think twice, except for the one sitting far in the corner, the one no one else seemed to go near, a medium-sized black-coated dog with pale, almost gray eyes that didn't dart around like the others, didn't bark, didn't wag its tail, just watched, completely still, as if it already knew who was coming. And when Lily saw him, she stopped walking, her hand tightening around her mother's sleeve as she whispered, "That one." And Megan hesitated, because there was something about the way the dog held its gaze, not aggressive, not scared, just aware, more aware than any dog she had ever seen. And yet before she could say anything, Lily had already stepped forward, kneeling down just outside the fence, her small fingers resting against the metal as she smiled softly. And the dog didn't move at first, didn't react the way most animals would to a child, but then slowly, almost carefully, it stood up and walked toward her, stopping just inches away, lowering its head. And in that quiet moment, it felt less like a meeting and more like a decision, like something had already been set in motion long before they arrived. And Ethan remembered exchanging a quick glance with Megan, the kind that says we're both unsure, but we can't explain why. And maybe that should have been enough to walk away. But Lily's face had already changed, the heaviness she had carried for months suddenly replaced with something lighter, something hopeful. And that was all it took. Because sometimes you don't choose the moment chooses you. And less than an hour later, Shadow was sitting in the back seat of their truck, silent the entire drive home, not pacing, not whining, just watching the road ahead as if he recognized every turn, every mile marker, every shadow stretching across the asphalt. And that was the first thing Megan noticed, not something loud or obvious, but something quiet, something that didn't quite fit, because most dogs look out the window, react to passing cars, to movement, to sound, but Shadow didn't. He just stared forward, unblinking, like he already knew exactly where they were going. And even then, something deep inside her whispered that this wasn't going to be a normal adoption, that this wasn't going to be a normal dog, but she pushed it aside, because sometimes the things that feel strange at first are the ones that matter the most, and she had no idea just how wrong that thought was about to become. The drive home should have felt like the beginning of something simple, something comforting, but the silence inside the truck lingered in a way that Megan could not ignore. And even after they pulled into their driveway, Shadow did not rush out like most dogs would, did not explore or sniff around with curiosity. Instead, he stepped down slowly, placing each paw with a kind of careful awareness, as if he were measuring the ground beneath him. And Lily laughed softly, calling his name with a brightness that had been missing for months, kneeling in the grass and wrapping her arms around his neck. And for a moment, everything looked normal, almost perfect, until Megan noticed that Shadow did not lean into the hug the way a typical dog might. He did not resist either, he simply stayed still, allowing it, watching, always watching, his pale eyes shifting not toward Lily, but past her, scanning the yard, the street, the tree line at the edge of their property. And that was the second moment that felt wrong, not enough to say anything out loud, but enough to settle quietly in the back of her mind, waiting, growing. As the hours passed and evening came, Ethan tried to keep things light, setting up a water bowl, checking the old dog bed they had stored in the garage, talking about training and routines, the kind of normal conversation that fills space when no one wants to admit they are unsure. And Lily followed Shadow from room to room, narrating everything he did like it was the most fascinating thing she had ever seen. But Shadow did not behave like a dog discovering a new home. He did not sniff every corner or get distracted by unfamiliar smells. Instead, he moved with purpose, slow and deliberate, pausing at doorways, standing still for long seconds as if listening to something no one else could hear. And once, just once, he walked straight to the back door and sat there, not scratching, not whining, just staring at the handle. And when Ethan opened it, expecting him to run outside, Shadow stepped onto the porch, looked into the dark yard, and then turned back inside without taking another step, as if whatever he had been checking for was not there. And Megan felt that same quiet pressure again, stronger this time, because it did not make sense. And she was the kind of person who trusted patterns, who understood animals in a simple, grounded way, and this did not fit any pattern she knew. And later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep on the couch with her hand resting against Shadow's side, Ethan lowered his voice and asked, almost casually, if she thought the dog was adjusting okay, and Megan hesitated longer than she meant to, choosing her words carefully, saying that maybe he just needed time, that some animals take longer to settle. But even as she said it, she knew it was not the full truth, because time did not explain the way Shadow positioned himself near Lily, always between her and the rest of the room, always angled slightly toward the windows. And it definitely did not explain what happened just after midnight, when Megan woke up to a faint sound, not loud enough to startle, just enough to pull her from sleep. And when she sat up, she realized the house was completely still, except for Shadow, who was standing in the hallway, unmoving, facing the front door, his body tense but controlled, not growling, not barking, just standing there as if he were waiting. And Megan held her breath without realizing it, listening, trying to hear what he heard. But there was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, no cars passing by, just silence. And after what felt like minutes but could have been seconds, Shadow slowly relaxed, turning his head slightly toward her, their eyes meeting in the dim light. And for the first time, Megan felt something she could not easily explain, not fear exactly, but the unsettling sense that this animal was not reacting to the world the way other animals did, that he was aware of. Something beyond what they could see, and the thought settled in her mind with a quiet certainty that she could not shake. This was not just a dog adjusting to a new home. Something else was happening, something they had not yet begun to understand. The next morning arrived too quietly, as if the house itself had decided to hold its breath, and Megan noticed it before she even opened her eyes. That strange stillness pressing against the walls, lingering in the air like something unfinished. And when she finally stepped into the kitchen, she found Shadow already there, sitting near the back window, not eating the food Ethan had carefully measured into his bowl, not pacing or restless, just sitting, his body angled toward the glass as he watched the yard beyond. And the sunlight spilling in should have softened the moment, should have made everything feel normal again. But it did not, because even in daylight, there was something deliberate about the way he observed the world, something that felt less like curiosity and more like calculation. And when Lily came running in, her hair still messy from sleep, calling his name with that same hopeful excitement, Shadow turned to her. Immediately, his posture shifting in a way that almost looked protective, and for a brief second, Megan felt relief, because there it was, the connection she had been waiting to see. Something simple, something reassuring, but it faded just as quickly when Shadow moved closer to Lily, positioning himself between her and the window again, his body forming a quiet barrier that no one had asked for. And Ethan noticed it too this time, his expression tightening slightly as he leaned against the counter, watching in silence. And though neither of them said it out loud, the question was there now, no longer easy to ignore. And as the day went on, the pattern continued in ways that became harder to dismiss. Shadow followed Lily from room to room, never more than a few feet away, but not in the playful, energetic way most dogs do. Instead, he stayed just close enough to intercept, always aware of where she was, where the exits were, where the windows faced. And when Megan tried to call him over for a treat, he did not respond at first, his attention fixed somewhere else entirely, until Lily gently said his name, and only then did he move, calmly, obediently, as if her voice carried a different kind of weight. And that was when Ethan made the decision, quietly but firmly, that they needed to have him checked, not because he was aggressive or unpredictable, But because nothing about this felt random anymore, it felt intentional, like Shadow was responding to something they could not see, something that did not belong inside the simple explanation of a rescue dog adjusting to a new home. And by late afternoon, they were back in the truck, the same silence filling the space again. Only now it felt heavier, more defined, and Lily sat in the back seat beside Shadow, her hand resting on his back, whispering to him like she always did, unaware of the tension building between her parents in the front. And when they arrived at the clinic, the familiar smell and clean white walls should have brought some sense of control, some reassurance that answers were coming. But instead, it only made everything feel sharper, more exposed, and as Dr. Ryan Collins greeted them with a polite smile and guided Shadow into the examination room, Megan felt that quiet pressure return, stronger than before, because now it was no longer just a feeling, it was a moment that would demand an explanation, and Shadow stepped onto the scale without resistance, holding still as the vet began his routine, checking his posture, his eyes, his breathing, all the normal things. And for a while, everything seemed ordinary enough, until Dr. Collins paused, his hand hovering midair, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly, and he leaned in closer, examining something beneath Shadow's fur, something that made his brow tighten in confusion, and then concern, and Ethan felt his stomach drop without knowing why, because there was no sudden noise, no dramatic reaction, just a subtle change in the room, like a quiet signal that something had just crossed a line from unusual into something far more serious. And when the vet reached for the scanner to check for a microchip, the device beeped once, then again, the sound inconsistent, uncertain, and Dr. Collins frowned, adjusting it, trying a second time, his movements slower now, more deliberate, and the silence that followed stretched just long enough for Megan to realize that whatever they were about to hear, it was not going to be simple, it was not going to be easy, and it was definitely not going to be what they expected. The second scan did not sound any better than the first, and this time Dr. Collins did not try to hide his reaction, his jaw tightening slightly as he adjusted the device again, pressing it closer against Shadow's side, as if distance might somehow be the problem. But the inconsistent beeping continued, uneven and unfamiliar, and Ethan shifted his weight, glancing at Megan before speaking, asking if something was wrong in a tone that tried to stay calm, but did not quite succeed. And for a brief moment the veterinarian did not answer, his eyes fixed on the small screen in his hand, as if he were waiting for it to correct itself. But it did not, and when he finally stepped back, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything he could have said, because it carried a kind of uncertainty that did not belong in a place built on clear answers. And Megan felt her fingers tighten instinctively around the strap of her purse as she watched him, waiting, hoping for something simple, something that would bring everything back into a normal frame of understanding. But instead Dr. Collins cleared his throat and said that the microchip reading was not consistent with any standard registry, explaining that it was returning fragmented data, incomplete, as if it did not fully match any known identification system, and Ethan frowned, asking if that meant it was damaged, something they could easily fix or replace. But the vet hesitated again, shaking his head slowly, saying that it was not behaving like a damaged chip, it was responding, just not in a way that made sense. And as he spoke, Shadow remained perfectly still on the examination table, not resisting, not reacting to the unfamiliar tools or the strange tension filling the room, just watching, his pale eyes moving from one face to another as if he understood more than they realized. And that quiet awareness made Megan's unease deepen, because it felt like they were the ones being observed, not the other way around. And Lily, still standing near the door, shifted closer, her small voice breaking through the silence as she asked if Shadow was okay. And that simple question seemed to pull Dr. Collins back into the moment, his expression softening slightly as he assured her that Shadow was not in pain. But there was something about the way he said it, careful, measured, that suggested there was more he was choosing not to say, at least not yet. And then he turned back to Ethan and Megan, lowering his voice just enough that Lily would not fully catch every word, explaining that there were additional irregularities, subtle differences in bone structure that he could feel during the exam, small details that might not be noticeable to the untrained eye, but did not align perfectly with what he would expect from A typical domestic dog, and Ethan felt that pressure in his chest return, stronger now, because the pieces were starting to form a pattern, one that did not lead anywhere good, and he asked what that meant, what they were dealing with. And for the first time, Dr. Collins did not try to soften his answer. He simply said that he needed to run a more detailed scan, something that would give a clearer picture of what they were seeing, and as he reached for the imaging equipment, the room seemed to narrow around them. The normal sounds of the clinic fading into the background, replaced by the quiet hum of a moment that was about to shift everything. And Megan watched as Shadow was guided gently into position. Still calm, still cooperative, as if none of this was unfamiliar to him, as if he had been here before in some form or another. And that thought settled into her mind with a quiet certainty that made her heart race, because it meant this was not random, it was not an accident, and whatever Shadow was, wherever he had come from, it was connected to something larger, something that had not yet revealed itself. And as the machine powered on and the first image began to form on the screen, Dr. Collins leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the outline appearing before him. And then he stopped completely, his hand gripping the edge of the counter as if to steady himself. And in that stillness, without raising his voice, without turning away from the screen, he said something that made the air in the room feel instantly colder, something that no one there was prepared to hear, and yet once spoken, could not be taken back. This is not what you think it is. For a few seconds, no one spoke, not because they did not have questions, but because none of them knew where to begin, and Megan felt her heartbeat echo in her ears as she took a small step closer to the screen, trying to make sense of the image that had stopped Dr. Collins in his tracks. But to her untrained eye it looked like a blur of shapes and shadows, nothing clear enough to justify the weight in his voice. And yet the way he stood there, completely still, told her that whatever he was seeing was not just unusual, it was something he had never expected to find. And Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice low but steady as he asked what exactly they were looking at. And this time, the veterinarian did not hesitate as long, but when he spoke, his words came slower, more carefully, as if he were choosing each one with precision, explaining that certain structures in the scan did not align with known canine anatomy, that there were variations, subtle but undeniable, in bone density and formation, and more importantly, there were signs of previous medical intervention, not recent, but not natural either, something that suggested Shadow had been examined or altered before. And the word altered hung in the air longer than anything else, settling into Megan's thoughts with a quiet dread, because it implied intention, it implied someone, somewhere, had done something to this animal. And she glanced at Lily, who was now holding onto the edge of the table, her eyes wide and confused, sensing the tension even if she did not understand it. And Megan forced a small reassuring smile that she did not feel, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but her attention was pulled back almost immediately when Dr. Collins pointed to a specific area on the screen, tracing a faint outline that he said should not be there, a pattern that did not belong. And Ethan leaned in, squinting, trying to see it, trying to understand, but the more he looked, the less certain he became, because it did not look like damage, it did not look like injury, it looked deliberate, organized in a way that felt designed rather than accidental. And that realization made his stomach tighten, because this was no longer about a strange pet. It was about something they had unknowingly brought into their home, something with a history they could not see. And then Dr. Collins stepped back from the screen, running a hand through his hair, as if grounding himself before turning toward them again, his expression now fully serious, no longer uncertain. And he said that based on what he was seeing, he could not classify Shadow as a standard domestic animal without further investigation. And that statement alone was enough to make Megan's breath catch. But he continued, explaining that the irregular microchip, combined with the structural anomalies, raised concerns that went beyond veterinary care, concerns that might require official attention. And Ethan felt a flash of disbelief, asking if that was really necessary, if they were overreacting. But the vet shook his head gently, not dismissing the question, but not backing down either, saying that in situations where an animal's origin could not be verified, and where there were signs of possible unauthorized modification or unidentified tracking technology, it was standard protocol to notify authorities, not as an accusation, but as a precaution. And the word authorities landed heavily in the room, making everything feel suddenly larger, more serious than anything they had prepared for, and Megan's thoughts raced, trying to connect everything: the strange behavior, the quiet awareness, the way Shadow had positioned himself near Lily, and none of it felt random anymore. It felt connected to something just out of reach, something that had not revealed its purpose yet. And as Dr. Collins moved toward the phone on the wall, pausing only briefly before picking it up, Ethan felt the last thread of normalcy slip away, because whatever happened next, there was no going back to the simple story they had believed when they first brought Shadow home. And as the vet dialed the number, speaking in a calm, measured tone that only made the situation feel more real, Shadow finally moved, not abruptly, not in panic, but slowly turning his head toward the door, his ears lifting slightly, his body shifting just enough to show that he had heard something before anyone else did. And in that quiet moment, before anyone else noticed, Megan saw it clearly for the first time: not fear, not confusion, but recognition, as if Shadow already knew who was coming. The call ended quietly, but the weight it left behind filled every inch of the room, and for a moment, no one moved, as if they were all waiting for something invisible to shift first. And then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a soft sound from the hallway outside, the faint echo of footsteps approaching, steady and measured. And before Dr. Collins could even say anything, Shadow was already standing, his body alert but not tense, his head angled toward the door with a focus that made it clear he had anticipated this exact moment. And Ethan felt a chill run through him as he realized that whatever was happening now, Shadow was not reacting to it. He was expecting it. And when the door finally opened, Officer Daniel Brooks stepped inside, his uniform crisp, his expression calm but observant, the kind of presence that immediately shifted the atmosphere from uncertainty to something more official, more real. And he nodded politely at Dr. Collins before his eyes moved to Shadow. And that was when something subtle changed, something almost imperceptible, because instead of approaching cautiously or with concern, the officer paused, studying the animal in a way that suggested recognition, not personal, but procedural, like he had seen something similar before. And Megan caught it, that brief hesitation, that flicker of understanding, and it made her stomach tighten, because it meant this was not entirely new, not entirely unknown. And Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady but edged with tension as he asked what was going on, what this was all about. And Officer Brooks glanced at him briefly before looking back at Shadow, explaining in a measured tone that they had received reports over the past few months of animals being found with irregular identification markers, cases that did not follow normal patterns. And while he did not elaborate fully, the implication was clear enough. This was part of something larger, something that extended beyond a single strange adoption. And Megan felt Lily's hand slip into hers, small and uncertain, and she squeezed it gently, trying to offer reassurance that she was no longer sure she could give. And then the officer took a slow step closer, not reaching out, not making any sudden movements, just observing. And Shadow did not back away, did not show fear or aggression. He simply watched him in return, the same quiet awareness in his eyes. And for a few seconds, the two of them stood there like that, facing each other in a silence that felt heavier than any conversation, until finally Officer Brooks spoke again, asking where the family had found him, how long they had him. And Ethan answered quickly, explaining about the roadside event, the volunteers, the way Shadow had been separated from the others. And as he spoke, the officer listened carefully, nodding slightly, but his attention kept returning to Shadow, as if the details only confirmed what he already suspected. And then he turned back to Dr. Collins, asking to see the scan results. And as the images were pulled up again, the room seemed to narrow once more, all eyes drawn to the screen. And this time, the officer leaned in closer, his expression tightening in a way that mirrored the vet's earlier reaction. And though he did not say anything immediately, the shift in his posture was enough to tell everyone that he saw it too. That same detail, that same pattern that did not belong. And Megan felt her breath catch as she realized that whatever this was, it was no longer just a question of identity. It was something that had drawn attention from people trained to recognize threats. And yet Shadow remained calm, unmoving, as if none of this concerned him, as if he was waiting for something else entirely. And then, Without warning, he turned his head slightly toward Lily, stepping closer to her side, positioning himself just enough to block her from the center of the room, not aggressively, not urgently, but with a quiet certainty that made Megan's heart race, because it was the same behavior she had seen before. Only now it carried a different meaning, one that was impossible to ignore. And in that moment, as Officer Brooks straightened and exchanged a brief look with Dr. Collins, Megan understood something she had been avoiding since the beginning. Whatever Shadow was, whatever had been done to him, he was not reacting out of confusion or fear. He was responding with purpose. And the most unsettling part was not that he was different. It was that he might be right about something they still could not see. For a brief moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said suddenly felt too heavy to put into words, and Megan could feel Lily pressing closer against her side, her small fingers gripping tighter, as if she sensed the shift in the room without fully understanding it. And Ethan took a slow breath, trying to steady himself, trying to hold on to something logical in a situation that no longer felt logical at all. And he looked at Officer Brooks again, asking quietly what exactly they were dealing with. And this time the officer did not avoid the question, but he also did not answer it directly, instead choosing his words carefully, explaining that in some rare cases animals were found with undocumented modifications or tracking systems, often connected to controlled environments or restricted programs. And while he made it clear that he could not confirm anything without further investigation, the possibility alone was enough to make the air feel heavier, more complicated, and Megan felt a wave of disbelief rise in her chest, because none of this matched the simple story they had believed just days ago. None of it fit with the image of a lonely animal waiting to be adopted at a roadside event. And yet Shadow stood there calmly, as if he had been part of something far more complex long before they met him. And Lily's voice broke through the tension again, softer this time, asking if they were going to take him away, and that question landed harder than anything else, because it forced everyone in the room to confront what was coming next, and Ethan immediately shook his head, instinctively reassuring her, even though he did not know if he could keep that promise, and Megan felt her throat tighten as she looked at Shadow, really looked at him for the first time without trying to explain him away, noticing the way he remained close to Lily, not clinging, not seeking comfort, but guarding, always positioning himself between her and whatever direction the room seemed to shift toward. And it was not random, it was consistent, deliberate, and that realization changed something inside her, because it meant his behavior had purpose. It meant he was not just different, he was responding to something they had not yet recognized. And then Officer Brooks spoke again, his tone slightly firmer now, explaining that until they could determine exactly what Shadow was and where he had come from, it would be safest to keep him under observation, to ensure that there were no risks involved. And the word safest echoed in Megan's mind, because it implied danger, even if no one had said it outright. And she felt that quiet resistance build inside her, not out of denial, but out of something deeper, something instinctive, because nothing Shadow had done felt threatening, nothing about him suggested harm. And yet everything about the situation suggested otherwise. And as the officer took a step forward, preparing to move closer, Shadow reacted again, not with aggression, not with fear, but with that same calm precision, shifting just enough to stay between Lily and the center of the room, his gaze steady, focused, and for a second, their eyes met, and Megan felt something she could not explain, a certainty that cut through the confusion, because there was no panic in him, no uncertainty, just awareness. And it made her wonder, not for the first time, if they had been asking the wrong question all along, because maybe the real issue was not what Shadow was, but what he was trying to do. And as that thought settled in her mind, subtle but undeniable, it changed the way everything looked, the way everything felt, because if Shadow was not the threat, then something else had to be, something that had not yet revealed itself, something that he had been watching for since the moment they brought him home. And the most unsettling part was that whatever it was, it might already be closer than any of them realized. The room did not change, not in any visible way, but something inside it shifted, something subtle and undeniable, like a line had been crossed without anyone noticing exactly when. And Megan felt it first in the way the silence deepened, not empty, but heavy, filled with something waiting to happen, and she realized that everyone in the room was now watching Shadow differently, not just as a strange animal, but as a piece of a larger puzzle they did not yet understand, and that realization made everything feel more fragile, more uncertain, because it meant they were no longer in control of what came next, and Officer Brooks seemed to sense it as well, his posture straightening slightly as he spoke again, explaining that they would need to contact additional departments, people who specialized in cases that did not follow normal classifications. And while his tone remained calm, the words themselves carried weight, suggesting that this situation was moving beyond routine procedures, beyond something that could be resolved quickly, and Ethan felt a flicker of frustration rise, asking how far this was going to go, how complicated this needed to become, because to him, Shadow was still the same animal they had brought home, still the same presence that had sat quietly beside Lily, and the idea that he could suddenly become something else, something that required outside intervention, felt impossible to accept. But before anyone could respond, a sound broke through the tension, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere beyond the clinic walls. A low vibration that seemed to travel through the floor more than the air, and Shadow reacted. Instantly, not startled, not confused, but focused, his entire posture shifting in a way that made Megan's breath catch, because it was the same reaction she had seen the night before, the same alert stillness. Only now it was sharper, more defined, and his gaze moved toward the far side of the room, not the door they had entered, but the opposite direction, as if whatever he sensed was not coming from the expected place. And Lily followed his movement, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked what he was looking at, and Megan shook her head slowly, because she did not know. But she could feel it too now, that faint unease creeping in, that sense that something was approaching, something just beyond their awareness. And Dr. Collins glanced toward the hallway, his expression tightening slightly as he tried to listen, but there was nothing clear, nothing obvious. Just that same subtle vibration that seemed to exist more as a feeling than a sound, and Officer Brooks took a step toward the door, instinctively checking the corridor outside. But it was empty, quiet, normal in every visible way, and yet Shadow did not relax, did not shift back into the calm stillness he had maintained before. Instead, he moved closer to Lily again, positioning himself with quiet precision, his body forming that same protective line. And this time Megan did not question it, did not try to explain it away, because she could feel the intention behind it, the clarity of it. And it made her heart race for a completely different reason now, not fear of him, but fear of whatever he was reacting to. And Ethan saw it too, the way Shadow's attention remained fixed, unwavering, and for the first time, he did not try to rationalize it, did not try to find a simple explanation, because there was none that fit anymore. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vibration faded, the quiet pressure in the room easing slightly, and Shadow's posture shifted again, not fully relaxed, but no longer on alert, and the change was so subtle that anyone who had not been watching closely might have missed it entirely. But Megan did not miss it, and neither did Officer Brooks, because their eyes met, briefly. And in that moment, there was an unspoken understanding that passed between them, something neither of them said out loud, but both of them recognized. Whatever had just happened, it was not random, it was not imaginary, and more importantly, it was not over, because if Shadow had been reacting to something before it reached them, then that meant whatever it was had not disappeared, it had only moved. And the realization settled into Megan's mind with a quiet certainty that she could no longer ignore. They had not adopted a strange animal. They had brought something into their home that was connected to something else entirely, something that was still out there, something that Shadow had been trying to warn them about from the very beginning. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it at the same time, that quiet realization settling into the space between them, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady and undeniable, like a truth that had been building since the very first moment Shadow stepped into their lives. And Megan looked down at Lily, who was now kneeling beside him, her small hand resting gently against his shoulder, completely unafraid, completely trusting, and for the first time since all of this began, Megan understood why. Not because Lily did not see the difference, but because she felt something the adults had been too distracted to recognize, something simple and clear beneath all the confusion. And Ethan slowly exhaled, running a hand across his face as he glanced between Officer Brooks and Dr. Collins, waiting for the next step, expecting more instructions, more procedures, something official that would take control of the situation, but instead, there was a pause, a long, thoughtful silence as the officer studied Shadow one more time. His expression no longer guarded in the same way, no longer focused only on the unknown factors, but something else now, something closer to understanding. And when he finally spoke, his tone had shifted, not dismissing the concern, but no longer escalating it either, explaining that whatever investigation might be required would take time, that there were no immediate indicators of threat, no signs that Shadow posed any danger, and that for now, the most reasonable course of action was observation rather than removal. And those words seemed to release something in the room, not completely, but enough to let everyone breathe again. And Lily smiled softly, leaning closer to Shadow as if she had been holding that moment in place all along. And Shadow, for the first time since they arrived, relaxed fully, lowering himself beside her, his body no longer angled toward the room or the door, but toward her, present in a way that felt calm and certain. And Megan felt her chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with something else entirely, something closer to clarity, because all the signs she had noticed before, all the moments that had felt wrong or out of place, suddenly aligned into something that made sense, not in a scientific or logical way, but in a human one. And she realized that Shadow had never been reacting randomly. He had been responding, watching, positioning himself. Not because he was uncertain, but because he was aware of something beyond their understanding, something that might never fully be explained, and yet had guided every one of his actions since the beginning. And Ethan stepped closer, crouching slightly as he looked at Shadow, his voice quieter now as he said that maybe they had been looking at this the wrong way. Maybe the question was not what Shadow was, but what he had been trying to do. And Dr. Collins nodded slowly, not as a definitive answer, but as an acknowledgement that there was more to this than any scan or data point could capture. And Officer Brooks added that sometimes the most important details were the ones that did not fit neatly into a report, the ones that required a different kind of understanding. And Megan felt that truth settle into her thoughts with a quiet certainty, because despite everything that had happened, despite the confusion, the fear, the unanswered questions, one thing remained consistent. Shadow had stayed close to Lily, had protected her in ways that did not need explanation, and that alone carried more meaning than anything else they had discovered. And as they prepared to leave, stepping back into the fading afternoon light, the world outside seemed unchanged, calm and ordinary. But Megan knew something inside their story had shifted permanently, something that could not be undone. And as Shadow walked beside them, silent as always, his presence no longer felt